The clatter of a silver fork on a porcelain plate was the only sound that dared to break the tension. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on the young waitress, standing perfectly still before the heir to the Castellano's fortune. He had just unleashed a torrent of insults, each word dripping with the arrogance of new money and old power. Her apron was stained. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze never wavered from his. The air crackled thick with the unspoken question on everyone's mind. Who was this girl? And what could she possibly say to change the unchangeable reality of her situation? She drew a breath, and with one sentence the entire glittering world of the Castellanos dynasty began to crumble. The Aurelia was the kind of restaurant that didn't just serve food, it sold an experience. Nestled in the heart of downtown, its discreet entrance was a portal into a world of hushed opulence. Crystal glasses shimmered under meticulously dimmed lights, reflecting the quiet confidence of its patrons. The city's old money, its new tech titans, and the occasional celebrity seeking refuge from the flash of cameras. For the staff, it was a different world. It was a nightly tightrope walk of perfect service, anticipating needs before they were spoken and becoming invisible when necessary. Tonight, the Aurelia was humming with its usual rhythm of quiet conversations and the soft clinking of cutlery. For Ella, a waitress with eyes that held a story far older than her 22 years, it was just another Tuesday. Another night of balancing plates, reciting specials, and smiling through the subtle condescension of those who saw her as nothing more than a pair of hands. She was good at her job, quick on her feet, and possessed a preternatural ability to remain calm in the face of the most demanding customers. It was a skill honed not in the hospitality industry, but in the crucible of a life she kept locked away, far from the polished floors of the Aurelia. Her designated section tonight included the coveted corner booth, a semi-private alcove that offered the best view of the city lights. It was reserved for a Mr. Beaumont, a name that sent a ripple of anxiety through the staff. Not because of the elder Beaumont, a reclusive but reportedly polite patriarch of a vast shipping empire, but because of his son, Nicholas. Nicholas Beaumont was a different breed. He wore his inherited wealth like a suit of armor, using it to bludgeon his way through a world he believed was his for the taking. He was notorious for his temper, his entitlement, and his cruel pleasure in belittling those he deemed beneath him. Ella prepared the table with practiced precision, her movements fluid and economical. She arranged the heavy silver, polished the wine glasses until they were invisible, and ensured the single white rose in its crystal vase was angled just so. She took a deep, steadying breath, a small ritual she performed before stepping into the orbit of a difficult guest. It was a moment to remind herself of who she was, beyond the starched uniform and the polite smile. Nicholas arrived precisely at 8, not with a quiet entrance, but with a presence that demanded attention. He was flanked by 2 friends, their laughter loud and boisterous, a stark contrast to the hushed ambiance of the Aurelia. Nicholas was handsome in a severe, almost cruel way. His dark hair was artfully disheveled, his jaw sharp, and his eyes, a startlingly light blue, held a look of perpetual boredom that often morphed into disdain. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than Ella earned in a year, but he wore it with a carelessness that screamed of unearned privilege. From the moment he sat down, the ordeal began. He snapped his fingers to get Ella's attention, a gesture that made her inwardly flinch, but outwardly she responded with a serene, "Yes, sir." He complained about the temperature of the water, the crispness of the complimentary breadsticks, and the placement of his chair, all in a tone that suggested these were personal affronts of the highest order. His friends, sycophants of the highest order, echoed his complaints and laughed a little too loudly at his weak jokes. Ella remained unflappable. She replaced the water, brought a fresh basket of breadsticks, and adjusted his chair with a quiet apology. Her calmness seemed to irk Nicholas more than any argument would have. He wanted a reaction, a flicker of fear or frustration in her eyes, but she gave him nothing. She was a smooth, impenetrable wall of professional courtesy. The appetizers came and went, each dish met with a new wave of complaints. The calamari was rubbery, the burrata insipid. Nicholas pushed his plate away with a theatrical sigh of disgust. "Is this the best you can do?" He sneered, not at the kitchen, but directly at Ella. "I am very sorry to hear that you are not enjoying the food, sir." Ella replied, her voice even. "Perhaps I could recommend something else." "The chef's risotto has been very popular this evening." Nicholas let out a short, barking laugh. "The chef's risotto. And what would you know about good food? Your palate is probably more accustomed to microwave dinners and instant noodles." His friends snickered. Ella's smile didn't waver, but a storm was gathering behind her eyes. She thought of her grandmother, whose risotto, made with ingredients from her own small garden, could bring tears to the eyes of those who tasted it. She thought of the love and care that went into every meal she had ever eaten at her family's table. The main course was a disaster. Nicholas had ordered the most expensive item on the menu, a dry-aged porterhouse steak cooked rare. When it arrived, he cut into it, stared at the deep red center, and threw his fork down with a clatter that silenced the entire restaurant. "This is raw," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the suddenly cavernous space. "Are you trying to poison me? I asked for rare, not still mooing." Every diner in the Aurelia was now looking at their table. The manager, a perpetually stressed man named Mr. Dubois, began to make his way over his face pale. But before he could reach them, Nicholas turned the full force of his fury on Ella. "Look at you," he said, his voice dripping with venom. He gestured at her with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "You're pathetic. You spend your nights serving people you could never hope to be. You smile and scrape and bow for a few pathetic dollars in tips. Is this what you dreamed of when you were a little girl, wiping the crumbs from my table?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more menacing than his shouts. "You are nothing, a ghost in the background of other people's lives, and you can't even get a simple steak right." He then picked up his glass of expensive red wine, swirled it, and with a deliberate, almost slow-motion movement, poured it onto the floor, splashing Ella's shoes and the hem of her black trousers. The gasp that went through the restaurant was collective. Mr. Dubois froze in his tracks, his mouth agape. Nicholas's friends looked suddenly uncomfortable, their sycophantic smiles gone. This had crossed a line, even for them. Ella stood still. She looked down at the crimson stain spreading on the pristine white marble, then back up at Nicholas's smug, expectant face. He was waiting for the tears, the apologies, the panicked rush to clean up his mess. He was waiting for her to break. But Ella didn't break. The years of practiced composure, the lifetime of holding her head high in the face of adversity, all coalesced in this one moment. The storm behind her eyes was about to be unleashed. She took a slow, deliberate breath. The polite waitress, the invisible servant, was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely, and she was about to say one sentence that would change everything. The silence in the Aurelia was a living thing. It was heavy, suffocating, and charged with the anticipation of what would happen next. Every diner, every member of the staff was a captive audience to the drama unfolding at the corner table. Nicholas Beaumont leaned back in his chair, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He had created his spectacle, and now he was ready to savor its climax. He expected tears apologies, perhaps even a desperate attempt to clean the wine from his feet. What he did not expect was the profound, almost unnerving stillness of the young woman standing before him. Ella did not move a muscle. She didn't look at the spreading puddle of red wine at her feet. She didn't look at the horrified face of her manager, Mr. Dubois, who seemed to be rooted to the spot. Her gaze was fixed solely on Nicholas, and for the first time that evening her polite professional mask had completely fallen away. What remained was an expression of such cold, clear focus that it was almost frightening. The air around her seemed to shimmer with an intensity that had nothing to do with the restaurant's expensive lighting. She took a single measured breath, and the world seemed to hold its own. Then, in a voice that was not loud, but carried with an astonishing clarity to every corner of the silent room, she spoke. The last time I saw a mess like that, it was made by a frightened child on the floor of the St. Jude's Children's Hospital, just after his 4th round of chemotherapy, and even he had more grace than you. The sentence hung in the air, each word a perfectly thrown stone into the still pond of the restaurant's opulence. It was so unexpected, so completely out of context with the evening's events, that for a moment no one knew how to react. Nicholas's smirk faltered, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. His friends exchanged confused glances. Mr. Dubois's jaw, which had been hanging open, snapped shut. It was the specificity of the sentence that was so devastating. It wasn't a general insult or a fiery comeback. It was a precise surgical strike, laden with imagery so powerful and so out of place that it shattered the gilded cage of the Aurelia. St. Jude's. Chemotherapy. A frightened child. These were words that did not belong in a world of dry-aged steaks and vintage wines. Nicholas was the first to recover his confusion, quickly morphing into rage. "What did you just say to me?" He snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "Are you insane? What does some sick kid have to do with anything?" Ella's gaze did not waver. "I'm saying," she continued, her voice still unnervingly calm, "that you are a spoiled, petulant boy who has mistaken his father's money for his own worth. You find pleasure in humiliating people because you have never known a single day of real hardship. You are a child, Mr. Beaumont, a very rich, very sad child." If her first sentence had been a stone, this was a boulder. The insult was no longer just about his behavior. It was about his entire existence, the foundation of his identity. His wealth, his power, his name, was being called into question by a waitress. Nicholas's face, which had been flushed with anger, now began to pale. His light blue eyes, which had held such disdain just moments before, now flickered with something else. It was a flicker of uncertainty, of something long buried and fiercely protected. "You have no idea who you're talking to." He whispered the words, barely audible. "Oh, I think I do," Ella replied, and now for the first time a hint of something that sounded like pity crept into her voice. "I know exactly who you are." It was at this moment that a new player entered the scene. From a table in the shadows, a man who had been dining alone rose to his feet. He was older, in his late 50s, with a quiet authority that was the complete opposite of Nicholas's boisterous arrogance. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, but unlike Nicholas, he wore it with an air of comfortable familiarity. It was the clothes of a man who had been wealthy for a very long time. He walked over to the table, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He did not look at Nicholas. He did not look at Ella's wine-stained shoes. He looked directly at Ella's face, and his expression was one of intense, unreadable scrutiny. "Miss," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. "Forgive me for interjecting. My name is Robert Harrison. I am a lawyer." Nicholas's head snapped up. "Mr. Harrison, what are you doing here?" There was a note of panic in his voice now. The name Harrison carried weight, even in Nicholas's rarefied world. Robert Harrison was not just any lawyer. He was one of the most respected and feared litigators in the country. He was known for his discretion, his brilliance, and his unwavering loyalty to his clients. And one of his most prominent clients was Nicholas's own father, the reclusive patriarch of the Beaumont Empire. Robert Harrison ignored Nicholas. He was still looking at Ella. "That was a very specific reference you made," he said, his eyes searching hers. "St. Jude's, the 4th round of chemotherapy. May I ask why you chose those particular words?" The entire restaurant was now leaning in, straining to hear. The initial drama of the spilled wine had been eclipsed by a mystery that was far more compelling. Who was this waitress, and what was her connection to the heart-breaking world of childhood cancer? And why did it seem to be having such a profound effect on Nicholas Beaumont, and his father's lawyer, Ella, held Robert Harrison's gaze? The storm in her eyes was now a maelstrom of emotions: grief, anger, and a deep, unyielding strength. The story she had kept locked away for so long was about to be brought into the light. "Because," she said, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly, "I was the nurse who administered that 4th round of chemotherapy to a little boy named Daniel. And just before I did, I held his hand, and I promised him that he was the bravest person I had ever met." She then turned her gaze back to Nicholas, and the look in her eyes was one of pure, undiluted contempt. "You, Mr. Beaumont, are not fit to speak his name." The silence that followed this revelation was deeper, more profound than before. It was a silence filled with the weight of a life lived and lost, of a courage that dwarfed the petty concerns of the people in this room. The story had taken a turn that no one could have predicted. The waitress was not just a waitress. She was a former nurse from St. Jude's, and she had just drawn a line in the sand, a line that separated the world of real suffering from the world of manufactured slights. And Nicholas Beaumont was on the wrong side of that line. The game had changed, and Ella, the quiet, invisible waitress, was now in control. The revelation that Ella was a former nurse from St. Jude's landed in the opulent dining room of the Aurelia with the force of a physical blow. The name of the hospital, synonymous with hope and heartbreak, in equal measure, conjured images that were a world away from the restaurant's gilded reality. The hushed whispers that had begun to ripple through the room died out, replaced by a stunned, respectful silence. The patrons were no longer just watching a confrontation. They were bearing witness to something far more profound. Nicholas Beaumont looked as if he had been struck. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his handsome features looking stark and almost skeletal under the dim lights. The name she had spoken, Daniel, seemed to hang in the air between them, a ghost that had suddenly materialized in the space that separated the entitled billionaire's son from the unassuming waitress. His friends, who had been enjoying his cruel sport just moments before, now looked at him with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. They had signed up for a night of casual cruelty, of punching down on someone they saw as insignificant, They had not signed up for this. This was real. This was messy. And it was clear that Nicholas was in a spiral they could not pull him out of. It was Robert Harrison, the lawyer, who broke the spell. His face, which had been a mask of professional curiosity, now showed a flicker of something else, a deep, almost pained recognition. He took a half-step closer to Ella, his voice softer now, more gentle. "Daniel." He repeated the name, a soft echo in the quiet room. "You were Daniel's nurse." Ella tore her gaze away from the reeling Nicholas and met Harrison's eyes. A single tear, which she had held back with ferocious willpower, finally escaped and traced a silent path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed grief. "I was with him for the last 6 months of his life." The past, which she had so carefully compartmentalized, came rushing back in a flood of memories. The sterile smell of the hospital, the constant beeping of machines, the heartbreakingly small hand that had gripped hers with so much trust. She remembered Daniel's smile, a smile that could light up the entire pediatric ward, even on his worst days. She remembered his love for superhero comics, his surprisingly deep voice when he would try to imitate his favorite characters, and the quiet courage with which he faced every painful procedure. And she remembered the day he had died, the profound, gut-wrenching emptiness of the room after he was gone. These were the memories she had run from, the memories that had driven her from a calling she had once loved. The emotional toll of working in pediatric oncology had become too much to bear. She had seen too much pain, shed too many tears, and a part of her had broken with every child she had lost. She had sought refuge in the anonymity of the service industry, in a job that was physically demanding, but emotionally detached. She had thought she could leave that part of her life behind. But tonight, Nicholas Beaumont, with his careless cruelty, had brought it all crashing back. Nicholas, meanwhile, was struggling to breathe. "Daniel," he croaked the name, a ragged, painful sound. "No, it can't be." He looked from Ella to Harrison, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening understanding. "What is this? What's going on?" Robert Harrison let out a long, weary sigh, the sigh of a man who has carried a heavy burden for a very long time. He turned to Nicholas, and for the first time there was no deference in his expression, only a profound and weary disappointment. "Nicholas," he said, his voice firm and clear, cutting through the haze of confusion. "Perhaps it is time you knew the full story." He then turned back to Ella, his expression softening once more. "Miss," he said, his voice full of a respect that Nicholas had so completely lacked, "my apologies for this public intrusion. But I believe you may be the only person who can make him understand." He gestured towards the still reeling Nicholas. "This young man's father, Mr. Beaumont Sr., is a very private man. He is also one of the largest anonymous benefactors of St. Jude's Children's Hospital." A collective gasp went through the room. The Beaumont name was known for shipping for real estate, for a ruthless and aggressive approach to business. It was not known for philanthropy, and certainly not for anonymous large-scale donations to a children's hospital. Harrison continued, his voice resonating with the weight of his words. "Over the last decade, the Beaumont Foundation has donated over $100 million to the hospital. It funded the very wing where you worked, Miss. It paid for the research that developed the experimental treatments that were used on many of the children in your care." Ella stared at him, her mind struggling to process this new information. The Beaumont name, which she had come to associate with arrogance and cruelty, was also the name behind the place that had been both her sanctuary and her personal hell. The irony was staggering. But Harrison was not finished. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say next. The foundation was started for a very personal reason. Mr. Beaumont's philanthropy is not born from a desire for tax breaks or public acclaim. It is born from grief and from guilt. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he looked directly at Nicholas, whose face was now a mask of utter devastation. "Nicholas, you had a younger brother." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with the finality of a judge's sentence. Nicholas recoiled as if he had been slapped. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in denial. "I'm an only child. I've always been an only child." "No," Harrison said gently. "You were not. You had a brother named Daniel. He was 4 years younger than you, and he died of leukemia when he was 7 years old." The ghost that had been hovering in the room now had a name and a face and a connection that was both tragic and undeniable. The Daniel whom Ella had nursed, the brave little boy with the superhero comics, was not just some random patient. He was a Beaumont. He was Nicholas's brother. The brother he had never known he had. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with a sickening thud. The anonymous donations, the father's reclusiveness, the name Daniel that had triggered such a visceral reaction in Nicholas, and it explained the look of pained recognition on Robert Harrison's face. He wasn't just the family lawyer. He was the keeper of the family's most painful secret. Nicholas stumbled back, his hand reaching out to steady himself on the table. He looked at Ella, but he didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw a ghost from a past he didn't know he had. He saw the last person to hold his brother's hand. "Why?" He choked out his voice, a strangled cry of anguish. "Why didn't I know? Why did no one ever tell me?" Robert Harrison's face was etched with a deep sadness. "Your father. He could not bear it. The loss of Daniel broke him. He and your mother decided to erase him. They packed away his things, took down his pictures. They never spoke his name again. They thought they were protecting you from the pain. But instead, they created a void that has been filled with anger and resentment your entire life." The truth in all its devastating, heartbreaking clarity was finally out. The arrogance, the entitlement, the cruelty, it was all a defense mechanism. It was the lashing out of a boy who had grown up in the shadow of a ghost he never knew existed. A boy who had sensed a profound sadness at the heart of his family, but had never understood its source. Ella looked at the broken young man before her, and the contempt she had felt just moments before was replaced by a wave of pity so profound it almost brought her to her knees. She had come to the Aurelia tonight expecting to serve food. She had not expected to serve up a family's darkest secret, and in doing so to completely unravel the life of the man who had insulted her. The drama had moved beyond the confines of the restaurant. It was now a tragedy of family secrets, of grief mismanaged, and of a life lived in ignorance of its most defining event. And she, the quiet waitress, was standing at its very epicenter. The revelation of a lost brother, a ghost named Daniel, who had silently haunted the opulent halls of the Beaumont estate, had shattered the world Nicholas knew. The Aurelia, with its dim lights and hushed atmosphere, transformed into a courtroom where the sins of the father were being laid bare. Nicholas, who had entered the restaurant as a prince, now stood as a pauper, stripped of his arrogance, and left with nothing but the raw, gaping wound of a grief he had never been allowed to feel. He sank into a chair, his body seeming to collapse under the weight of the truth. He stared at his hands, the same hands that had so carelessly thrown down his fork in disgust. and saw them now as the hands of a stranger. Who was he, if not the sole heir, the center of his parents' world? The anger that had been his constant companion for as long as he could remember was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching confusion. "My father," he whispered the words, catching in his throat. He built a hospital wing." Robert Harrison nodded grimly. "The Daniel Beaumont Pediatric Oncology Wing at St. Jude's. Your father has visited it only once on the day it was dedicated. He has never been back. He manages his grief from a distance through checkbooks and foundation meetings. It's the only way he knows how." The image was a stark and tragic one. A powerful titan of industry, a man who could move markets with a single phone call, rendered helpless by the memory of his youngest son. A man who could build a monument of philanthropy, but could not bring himself to speak his own child's name to his other son. Ella watched this scene unfold, her own grief momentarily forgotten in the face of this family's profound dysfunction. She had judged Nicholas so harshly and with good reason. But now, seeing the broken man behind the monstrous facade, she felt a complex mix of emotions. There was pity, yes, but there was also a flicker of something else, a strange, unsettling connection. She and this man who had so viciously insulted her were bound together by the memory of the same little boy. She had been Daniel's comfort in his final days, and Nicholas was the brother Daniel had never had the chance to know. Mr. Dubois, the manager who had been hovering nearby like a nervous bird, finally saw his moment. He approached the table cautiously, his eyes darting between Nicholas Harrison and Ella. "Mr. Harrison," he said in a low, deferential tone. Perhaps we could move to a more private setting. My office is available." Harrison nodded, placing a gentle hand on Nicholas's shoulder. "Come on, son." He said the word son, carrying a paternal weight it had never held before. "Let's go." Nicholas allowed himself to be led away, like a man in a trance. His friends, now looking utterly useless and deeply uncomfortable, stood up, mumbled a few incoherent apologies, and practically fled the restaurant. The drama had become too real for them, a harsh spotlight on the superficiality of their own lives. As Nicholas was guided towards the back of the restaurant, his eyes met Ella's one last time. There was no anger in them now, no arrogance. There was only a desperate, pleading question. "Who are you? How do you fit into this story?" The remaining diners began to murmur amongst themselves, the shock giving way to a fevered exchange of whispers. They had just witnessed the public unraveling of one of the city's most powerful families. It was a story they would be telling for weeks, embellished with each retelling. Ella stood alone at the table, the wine on the floor, and the now cold plates a testament to the chaos that had just erupted. She felt a hand on her arm and turned to see Mr. Dubois. His expression was a mixture of awe and terror. "Miss," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to say. You are free to go home, of course. We will handle this." He was looking at her, as if for the first time no longer seeing a waitress, but a woman who had single-handedly brought a billionaire's son to his knees. Ella simply nodded, feeling a bone-deep exhaustion settle over her. She untied her apron, the familiar ritual now feeling strange and foreign. As she walked through the now buzzing restaurant towards the staff exit, she felt the stares of the patrons on her back. She was no longer invisible. She was the woman who had spoken one sentence and changed everything. Once outside the cool night air was a welcome shock to her system. She leaned against the brick wall of the alleyway, the sounds of the city a distant hum. The events of the evening played over in her mind like a fever dream. The insults, the spilled wine, the ghost of a little boy named Daniel. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from her former colleague at St. Jude's, another nurse with whom she had shared the trenches of the pediatric oncology ward. "Thinking of you," the message read. It was a simple yet profound coincidence, a reminder of the life she had left behind, and the life that had just come crashing back into her present. She was about to reply when a sleek black car, the kind that whispers of quiet old money, pulled into the alley and stopped beside her. The back window slid down with a soft whir, and she saw Robert Harrison's face illuminated by the soft glow of the car's interior lights. "Ella," he said, using her first name for the first time. "May I have a word?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and walked towards the car. "I cannot apologize enough for what happened in there," he said, his voice laced with genuine remorse. "Nicholas's behavior was inexcusable, but I hope now that you know the circumstances, you can find it in your heart to understand, if not to forgive." Ella began, but she didn't know what to say. Forgiveness was a concept that felt miles away. "There is more to this story," Harrison continued, his voice low and urgent, "and I believe you are a part of it, in a way you cannot yet imagine. Mr. Beaumont Sr., he is not in the city. But I have spoken to him. He is flying back tonight. He wants to meet you." Ella's heart skipped a beat. The reclusive patriarch, the man who had built an empire and hidden a tragedy, wanted to meet her. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because," Harrison said, his eyes holding hers with a new intensity, "in the 6 months you were his nurse, you kept a detailed journal of your time with Daniel. You wrote down the things he said, the stories he told, the pictures he drew. You gave that journal to the hospital archives when you left." Ella's blood ran cold. The journal. She had forgotten about the journal. It was a way for her to process the emotional toll of her work, a way to honor the memories of the children she had cared for. She never imagined anyone else would read it. "The hospital," Harrison continued, "gave that journal to your father a few years ago, thinking it might bring him some comfort. He has read it every single night since. It is his only connection to the son he lost. Through your words, he has gotten to know Daniel in a way he never could when he was alive." He paused, letting the weight of this revelation sink in. "Ella, you didn't just nurse his son. In a way, you raised him in his father's memory. You gave a grieving father back his child. And now he wants to meet the woman who did that for him." The story had taken another impossible turn. She was not just a witness to this family's tragedy. She was an Intertaugstrokel of its secret history. The journal, her private words of grief and remembrance, had become a sacred text for a man she had never met, a man whose other son she had just publicly humiliated. "There's more," Harrison said, his voice dropping even lower. "Your name, Ella. It was Daniel's mother's name. She died a few years after Daniel from what the doctors called a broken heart." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and it was the most devastating of all. The story was no longer just about a lost brother or a grieving father. It was a story of a family completely destroyed by grief, a story of echoes and coincidences that were almost too tragic to be believed. And now she, Ella, was being pulled into its very heart. The meeting with the father was no longer just a request. It was a summons to face the ghost of the past and to confront the man whose shadow had loomed so large over all of their lives. The drive to the Beaumont estate was a journey into another world. They left the glittering lights of the city behind the sleek black car, gliding through quiet, tree-lined streets where the houses were not houses, but mansions set back from the road behind imposing gates and manicured hedges. Ella sat in the plush leather seat, the silence in the car as heavy as the one that had fallen in the restaurant. Robert Harrison drove his focus on the road, but Ella could feel his occasional glances a mixture of concern and calculation. She was no longer just a waitress who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was a key to a locked room in the heart of the Beaumont family, a room that contained all their grief and all their secrets. The knowledge was a heavy weight in the pit of her stomach. Her journal, her private musings on a little boy's courage, had become a lifeline for a powerful, broken man. And the coincidence of her name. It was a twist of fate so cruel, so bizarre, that it felt like something out of a Greek tragedy. The car turned into a long, winding driveway, and the Beaumont estate came into view. It was not just a mansion, it was a palace, a sprawling edifice of pale stone with dozens of windows that glowed with a soft, warm light. It was a home built to project power and permanence, but Ella knew with a chilling certainty that it was a house built on a foundation of sorrow. Harrison led her through a grand, echoing foyer, the floors a dizzying mosaic of black and white marble. The air was still and cool and smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. They did not go into one of the grand reception rooms. Instead, Harrison led her down a long, quiet hallway to a pair of tall oak doors. He paused before them, his hand on the ornate brass handle. "He is waiting for you in his study," he said, his voice low. "Nicholas is here as well. I must warn you, Mr. Beaumont can be an intimidating presence. But he is not the man his son is, or rather, the man his son was." He gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Just be yourself, Ella. That is all he wants." Harrison opened the doors and ushered her inside, then closed them softly behind her, leaving her alone with the two Beaumont men. The study was a cavern of a room lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. A fire crackled in a large stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the rich, dark wood. In the center of the room by the fire sat two figures. One was Nicholas, his head in his hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The other was a man who could only be his father. Mr. Beaumont, Sr., was a man forged from the same mold as his son. But where Nicholas was all sharp edges and volatile energy, his father was a study in stillness and control. He was older, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, but he possessed a vigor that defied his years. He was dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers, but he radiated an aura of immense power, a power that was not flaunted, but simply was. His face was a mask of stern composure, but his eyes, the same startlingly light blue as his son's, held a deep, profound sadness that seemed to pull all the light in the room towards them. He rose to his feet as Ella entered, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at her, his gaze so intense, so searching, that she felt as if he were looking into her very soul. It was the same look Robert Harrison had given her, but 100 times more powerful. "Miss," he said, finally, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room. "Thank you for coming. I am Arthur Beaumont." Ella found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "Mr. Beaumont." Arthur Beaumont gestured to a large leather armchair opposite his own. "Please sit." She sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Nicholas did not look up. He seemed to be frozen in his own private hell. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then Arthur Beaumont spoke again, his voice now softer laced with a pain that was almost palpable. "Mr. Harrison has explained what happened tonight at the restaurant. My son's behavior was unforgivable. There are no excuses for it, only reasons. And it seems you have brought those reasons into the light." He looked at Nicholas, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed his stern features. It was a look of such profound regret, such deep, aching love, that it made Ella's heart ache in sympathy. "I have failed my son," he said, his voice thick with self-recrimination. "In my attempt to shield him from my grief, I have starved him of the truth. I have allowed him to grow up in a house of whispers and shadows, and I have mistaken his anger for a lack of character, when it was in fact a cry of pain." He then turned his gaze back to Ella, and now his eyes were shining with unshed tears. "And then there is you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The woman who knew my other son." He reached for a book on the table beside him. It was a simple cloth-bound journal, its cover worn from countless readings. Ella's journal. Her heart pounded in her chest as he opened it, his large, powerful hands surprisingly gentle with the fragile pages. "I have read your words 1,000 times, he said, his voice trembling. "You wrote about his laugh, about the way he would hum when he was concentrating on a drawing. You wrote about his fear of needles, but how he would always pretend to be brave for the younger children. You wrote about the day he told you he wasn't afraid to die, because he knew his mother would be waiting for him." A sob escaped Arthur Beaumont's lips, a raw, ragged sound that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. Nicholas finally looked up, his face a mess of tears and confusion. He was seeing his father, the powerful, unshakable patriarch, break for the first time in his life. "You gave me back my son, Ella," Arthur whispered, clutching the journal to his chest as if it were a holy relic. "You gave me the memories I was too cowardly to make for myself. I was so consumed by my own pain, by my own guilt, that I ran away. I built a business empire. I threw money at a hospital, all in a desperate attempt to outrun his ghost. But you sat with him. You held his hand. You listened to him. You loved him. And for that, I am in your debt for the rest of my life." The raw, unvarnished grief in the room was overwhelming. Ella felt tears streaming down her own face, not just for Daniel, but for this broken family, for the years of unspoken pain and misunderstanding. It was Nicholas who finally broke the silence. He rose to his feet, his movements clumsy, uncertain. He walked over to Ella, his eyes red and swollen. He looked nothing like the arrogant boy who had poured wine on her shoes just a few hours ago. He looked like a lost child. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What I did to you. It was monstrous. I was monstrous. I didn't know." The words were inadequate, but they were true. He was a man waking from a long, terrible dream, and the reality of his own actions was just beginning to dawn on him. Ella looked at him, at the father who was now openly weeping at the journal that contained so much of her own heart, and she knew that this was a moment of profound, life-altering change. The sentence she had spoken in the restaurant had not just been a comeback. It had been a key. It had unlocked a door that had been sealed for 2 decades, and in doing so, it had unleashed a flood of grief that was both devastating and perhaps cleansing. But the story was not over. The secrets had been revealed, the ghosts had been named. But the consequences of this night were still to come. For in revealing the truth, Ella had not just changed the lives of the Beaumonts, she had irrevocably changed her own. And she was about to discover that the past once unearthed has a way of shaping the future in ways no one can predict. The meeting was not just an apology, it was a turning point, and the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty for all of them. In the quiet, heavy aftermath, the Beaumont estate became a house of ghosts finally being laid to rest. The truth unleashed by Ella's single sentence forced a reckoning that was decades overdue. Nicholas vanished from his glittering social scene, choosing a self-imposed exile within the mansion's stone walls. The arrogance that had been his armor was gone, shattered, leaving behind a raw and aching vulnerability. For the first time, he and his father truly spoke. The conversations were stilted at first, full of the awkwardness of two strangers learning a shared language of grief. Arthur Beaumont, a man who commanded boardrooms with unshakable authority, stumbled over the memories of his lost son. He spoke of Daniel's love for drawing superheroes, his quiet giggle the specific shade of his mother's eyes that he had inherited. Each story was a precious, painful artifact unearthed from the sealed tomb of his heart. For Nicholas, every detail was a revelation, painting a portrait of the brother he never knew he'd lost. The anger that had poisoned his life began to recede, replaced by a profound, hollowing sadness for the family he was only just beginning to understand. Ella, meanwhile, knew she could not return to the Aurelia. She could no longer pretend to be invisible. 2 days after that fateful night, a courier delivered an envelope to her small apartment. Inside was a check from Arthur Beaumont for an amount so vast it could rewrite her future. It was a golden key to a life without financial worry, a silent thank you for her role in their family drama. She stared at it for a long time. It was a tempting escape, a reward for her pain. But accepting it felt wrong. It felt like payment for Daniel's memory, a transaction that would cheapen the genuine connection she had felt for the little boy. It was a gilded cage, and she had just escaped one. With resolute certainty, she sent the check back. With it, she included a short, handwritten letter. In it, she respectfully declined the money, stating that her time with Daniel was a memory she treasured, not a service she had rendered. She ended with a simple, powerful challenge. If you truly wish to honor Daniel's memory, don't just fund the wing of a hospital. Go there. Sit with the children. Hold their hands. Let them know they are not alone. Her act of defiance did not go unanswered. A week later, Robert Harrison appeared at her door. He looked at her with a new level of respect and awe. "Your letter, Ella," he said, his voice holding a note of wonder. It accomplished what $100 million could not. It reached him. Harrison explained that Arthur Beaumont was a changed man. Inspired and humbled by her words, he was stepping back from his company to devote his life to philanthropy. Not from a distance, but from the front lines. He was restructuring the entire Beaumont Foundation with a new central purpose. He is creating the Daniel Beaumont Patient Advocacy Program, Harrison explained. It will provide families with everything they need: counseling, housing, transportation, and a dedicated advocate to guide them through the nightmare of pediatric cancer. He paused, his gaze direct and full of meaning. He wants you to run it, Ella. He wants you to be its first director. He knows you have the experience, the empathy, and the integrity this work demands. He is offering you a blank check, not for you, but for the children. to build this program from the ground up in Daniel's name. The offer was staggering, a chance to return to the world she had fled, but on her own terms. It was an opportunity to transform her pain into purpose. Before she could fully process it, Harrison added one final crucial detail. "Nicholas wants to see you," he said gently. "He wants to apologize face to face. Without his father, without me. He wants to stand before you on his own." It was the last piece of the reckoning. For the family to truly heal and for Ella to fully move on, this final meeting had to happen. It would be the true test of whether the boy who had been a monster could become a man worthy of forgiveness. The park was a world away from the gilded cages of the Aurelia and the Beaumont estate. In the clear light of day, Nicholas waited on a simple bench, looking smaller and more vulnerable without the armor of his expensive suits. As Ella approached, he stood, his former arrogance replaced by a profound and heavy shame. "Ella," he began, his voice quiet and strained, "thank you for meeting me. There are no words to undo what I did. Sorry isn't enough. My behavior was monstrous, and I can't excuse it even with the truth I've learned about my past." He looked at her, his eyes, so like his brother's, filled with a desperate need for understanding. "I read your journal. You knew Daniel. You saw his courage, his light, and in my ignorance I dishonored his memory with my cruelty. You faced me with a truth I never knew, and you changed my world." Ella listened, seeing not the monster from the restaurant, but a man shattered and slowly being rebuilt by a painful reality. The last embers of her anger cooled, replaced by a solemn empathy. "What you did was cruel, Nicholas," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But it came from a deep, hidden pain. I understand that now." She took a breath, feeling a weight lift from her own shoulders. "My grandmother taught me that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, a way to let go of the poison. And I forgive you." The words seemed to hang in the air, and for the first time a genuine, unforced smile touched Nicholas's lips. Relief washed over his face. "The foundation," he said, his voice filled with a new, fragile hope. "The program in Daniel's name. My father told me he offered you the chance to lead it. I hope you will." He hesitated, his next words a humble plea. "And I want to help, not as a director or a Beaumont, just as a volunteer. I need to learn how to build something good instead of just breaking things." It was an offer of penance and a promise of a new beginning. Looking at the changed man before her, Ella felt a sense of profound closure. The ghosts of the past had not vanished, but they were no longer haunting them. They were memories, guiding them toward a better future. "I think," she said, a small, genuine smile gracing her own lips, "that Daniel would have liked that." The story of Ella and the Beaumonts is a powerful reminder that beneath the surface of our daily lives, hidden dramas and profound truths are waiting to be uncovered. It shows us that a single moment of courage, a single sentence spoken with conviction, can unravel decades of secrets and set in motion a chain of events that can lead to healing and redemption. This wasn't just a story about a waitress and a billionaire's son. It was a story about grief, forgiveness, and the surprising ways our lives can intersect. It proves that you never truly know the battles the people around you are fighting. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up to show your support. Don't forget to share it with someone who might need to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will make you think and feel. Click that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change your perspective.